I don't want to be dramatic, but I think the first book I read in 2025 might just be my book of the year and one of my favorite books of all time. So today I am here to talk about The Given Day, Live by Night, and World Gone by Dennis Lehane. These are also known as the Coughlin books or the Coughlin Trilogy. I prefer to think of them as the Coughlin books because they are connected, but more loosely so. You don't have to read all three of them in order to get the story or the full story. So the way I think of it, The Given Day is historical fiction and a standalone. You don't need anything else to get a satisfying story. It's completely its own thing. Live by Night is a sequel in the sense that it's in the same world. The character that we follow in Live by Night is a character in The Given Day, but a more minor character. But it restarts. So you could technically start with Live by Night or just not read it and be satisfied. World Gone By is a direct sequel to Live by Night. They go together. Starting with World Gone By wouldn't really make sense. However, I would say in terms of the last two, I think you have a bit more of a thematic impact if you have read The Given Day. We'll start with The Given Day. The Given Day was my first read of 2025, and what a way to start the year. It's historical fiction set in 1919 in Boston, but the way I would pitch this is that this is a book for anybody that loves reading and loves books. I think it transcends genre. It's not a book that's, oh, if you love fantasy of this type, you'll love it. Or if you love crime fiction, you'll love it. Or you might like it if you're into literary fiction. I think if you love stories and if you love reading, you should read this book and you'll at least enjoy it. I don't really see how you wouldn't. So what is this book about? So our main character is Danny Coughlin. He is a young Irish-American cop in Boston. And you might wonder, what is it that is going on in 1919 that makes it an interesting time period to set a historical fiction novel in? And the answer is loads. And this is essentially a novel about class. It is set in a time of political unrest, at a time when people's salaries haven't changed in a long time, and therefore their standard of living might be lower than it was at the time of their parents when they were their age. People are struggling to make ends meet, people are struggling to pay their rent, and they're turning to potential alternatives. They're getting angry at the system. Some people want to try to change that system. Other people want to blow it up, literally or figuratively. And some people just want to give up on it altogether and live outside of that system. Does that sound familiar at all? I think this is an incredibly relevant book. And it's interesting, it was written about 15 years ago, I believe. And it's set 100 years ago, and I think it's extremely relevant to what we're living through today. This is a book about revolutionaries and the systems that both oppress them and create them at the same time. And it is about the dangers and the conveniences of lumping a very large group of people with very different ideas and ways to go about things all in the same group in order to discredit them. This is obviously set 2 years after the Russian Revolution, so we have kind of the early days of anti-communist sentiment in America. It's very interesting for that reason. It actually made me want to read some non-fiction about that time period, and I picked up China Miéville's October, which is his non-fiction about the Russian Revolution, just to kind of read alongside it. Obviously set in a different place, but a very significant world event that directly influences the situation that these characters are in this book. So that's cool. I like when books transcend the good story to make you think about real life and make you pick up other things that might not seem related but are, because you're just pulling on a thread. And on the flip side of that, I like books that have a message and depth and just a lot of work around theme and character and yet they don't neglect to also tell a great story. And The Given Day is a great story about people, about love and loss and family and friendship. And it has what might be one of my favorite characters that don't fall neatly in a villain or a hero category. He's not an anti-hero, he's not really an antagonist either. It's just a character that at times you feel like you've figured out, at times you really want to hate, at times seems hate-worthy, and then will turn around and give you a little bit of a glimpse of depth and make you realize that there's a real person with an entire world of experiences behind the moment that you've just read 200 pages before that made you make up your mind about him. And this character is the father of Danny, like of the main character. And he might be, I won't say my favorite character in these books because there are other characters that I love, but I think he's the most interesting character and incredibly well written. Dennis Lehane is very subtle in how he creates character. He lets them speak for themselves. A lot of it comes out in not just in the dialogue, but also in the way he describes people, in the way people think about each other. And he manipulates the reader by putting you in somebody's perspective and getting their view on somebody else. And then through dialogue, he might recontextualize that a little bit. I think Dennis Lehane is an incredible writer. I discovered him last year for myself, and I loved Mystic River and Small Mercies, so I already knew that he was a great writer, but this book really solidified that he's one of my favorite writers, that I will read everything that he's ever written very, very soon, and that he's just very, very good at what he does. This novel is emotional, it is engaging, it is enraging at times. It makes you think and reflect about what you're reading, but it also just tells a great story, and I absolutely loved it. Which means that when I finished it, I just couldn't stop myself and I went straight into Live by Night. So Live by Night is set about 7 years after The Given Day in 1926. That's where it starts. And we're following Joe Coughlin, who is Danny's younger brother. And he is a different type of character altogether. He is a criminal. And Live by Night is a crime novel. Now, I don't think that it would only appeal to crime readers. It is historical crime. So it takes us from the mid-20s to the mid-30s through the organization of crime, if you will. We have bootleggers and fedoras and flappers, and it's great. The vibes and the setting are fantastic. He's in a couple of different places, but mainly Boston and then Tampa, Florida. And it's a really great novel of organized crime. I don't think it has the thematic depth that The Given Day has. That is difficult to achieve. But, like I said at the beginning of the video, I think if you've read The Given Day before reading Live by Night, you have some more weight going into it because you know more about Joe's context and how he grew up, but also because you have the thematic context from The Given Day. And here you have a person that sees the world very differently from Danny in The Given Day, but you completely understand how they came from the same context and household. Here's a person that doesn't believe in the system and just decides to live outside of it. And there were a couple of times reading, especially the first half of the book, where I found myself kind of chuckling and thinking, maybe if I read this when I was 16, I would have maybe fancied the main character. And reading it now, I was just thinking, oh, boy, you're so naive, you're such a child. He fancies himself an outlaw and resists for a very long time being called a gangster. He's not a gangster, he's an outlaw, which sounds so much cooler and more free, but ultimately he's still beholden to a system. It's just a different system. But it's a great book. I absolutely loved it. I think you can read it by itself and just have a fun crime novel with the mafia in the 1920s and 30s. But you can also project some depth onto it, especially because I had just read The Given Day and I still had those things in mind. And needless to say, Dennis Lehane is just great at constructing stories and characters, and that continues in Live by Night. And then I figured, why not continue while I'm at it? And I read World Gone By. So World Gone By, like I mentioned, is a direct sequel to Live by Night. I think theoretically you could start with that one because it's a contained story, but why would you do that? I don't think that's a great idea. This is a much more contained story than the first two. So where The Given Day takes place over a year but is epic in terms of what it's exploring, and Live by Night has a bigger scope in terms of how much time passes. We spend almost a decade with Joe in that book. World Gone By takes place over a couple of months and mainly over a couple of days. And the concept here is that Joe finds out that somebody has been hired to kill him. And he is trying to find out who did the hiring so he can stop that from happening. That means the concept is a lot smaller, the scale is smaller. We have a much more traditional just crime story, a hitman and different people backstabbing each other, and there's some tropes of organized crime stories. So I loved it because I love those kinds of stories, but I do think of the three, it's the most standard in terms of what's going on, like what he's setting out to do. However, because I read them all three together, I did feel by the end that I'd read a big epic with payoff, and I felt a huge sense of accomplishment. And I got quite emotional. We spent so much time with characters, even though the cast of characters in Live by Night and World Gone By is essentially a complete reboot, except for like maybe 2-3 people max from The Given Day. You still spent a lot of time, I suppose, in a world, in an area, with a family, and it pays off. So even though the third one is the most contained and limited, sounds like a bad thing, but it's just telling like a tiny little story within this big world, it still felt like a worthy conclusion, almost like a little epilogue to the other two books, I'd say. Yeah, an epilogue is a good way to describe it, where I think The Given Day and Live by Night kind of stand side by side, even though I would put The Given Day as the higher quality. And then World Gone By is a little conclusion epilogue to what you just read. I urge you to read these books, especially The Given Day. I think if you are in the mood for an epic character-driven story about people, about life. I said earlier that this is a book about class, and I think class dictates what your life is going to be like, and it dictates the set of rules that you're going to have to play by, or at least that you're supposed to play by. And that is what this book is about. I think it's extremely relevant, even though it's historical fiction. I think it's very engaging. It's a great time. If you want characters that you'll get invested in and just be swept away in a story, it is relatively slow paced for most of it. So I could see as a potential criticism if that's not something that you're in the mood for. But the writing is marvelous, and I think it's the kind of book that lends itself to reading it a bit slower. I actually took a few weeks to read it, like a couple of chapters at a time, because then you just have more time to digest it as you're reading it. So I really enjoyed that. I would recommend it to pretty much anybody. And the other two, if you like the first one, absolutely give them a go. They're well worth your time. And I'm just delighted to have found a new favourite author. So more Dennis Lehane to come this year, I am sure.
You're welcome.
Do let me know if you're interested in these books. Let me know if you've read one or more of them and what you thought. Would love to chat to you in the comments. You can like the video if you liked it, and subscribe to the channel if you loved it. All that stuff that I'm supposed to tell you to do. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.